Good morning. Reverend Sugino, our moderator, thank you very much. And Reverend Sugitani, our chairman of the Standing Commission, a particular gratitude to you for years and years of wonderful service to us all. I want to suggest that the word ethical in our symposium's title has very, very specific importance. Importance in this room, but indeed importance for our entire human family as we struggle with this issue. And struggle it is. Reverend Sugino, in your introductory remarks, you very helpfully noted the ambivalence that we're all enduring. On the one hand, we feel signs of encouragement. On the other hand, we see counter signs present in the same moment. So I think, Reverend Sugino, it's helpful that you bring that as a basic frame that we are trying to work on. Now, as for the ethical dimension, I glanced at the draft statement that has just been distributed to us. And I was heartened to see in that statement a simple line that the non-expert, ordinary men and women, high school students, have a moral compass. They have their conscience. And this mysterious faculty of the human person is a guide. And it allows ordinary people who are not experts to come to a recognition that these monstrous weapons are immoral. And this is, I think, a source for all of us to draw strength and encouragement. The large issue is clear even to people who have not had the time to study it, who may not be lawyers, but are utterly sincere and good people. So that's encouraging. But back to Reverend Sugino, we are faced with an ambivalent, ambiguous, extremely difficult situation. Last night at dinner, I had the pleasure of resuming an ongoing conversation with a man I admire greatly and I regard as a friend, and that is you, Undersecretary Akashi. And we were reflecting that moral issues are issues because they're not easy. If it's simply choosing between right and wrong, you don't have a dilemma. You choose what's right. But in a situation that people like Mr. Akashi have been in, charged, mandated as a servant to very, very difficult circumstances, the choice is often not simply between right and wrong. It's between endless shades of gray in which all kinds of unintended consequences co-attend decisions that are being made. So it is that the moral examination of this issue demands real attention from people like ourselves. We've got to drill down. Father Michael, you mentioned a term that we have to, anyway, double down was the term that you used. Michael, Father Michael, bring our attention to it. Now, I'm going to generalize and simplify very greatly. But the field of ethical discourse is complicated. Every area the human beings really devote themselves allows a great deal of elaboration. But broadly speaking, there are two streams of moral thinking that can be useful for us. One stream goes by a very fancy name, and these are the deontologists. And that fancy name simply regards the act itself in terms of its basic morality. Is it morally consistent or is it inconsistent? Is the fact of nuclear weapons a good? Well, the overwhelming consensus within Religions for Peace across all religious traditions is that they're not good. They're monstrous. They're designed to indiscriminately kill, and therefore they are objectively evil. So from that point of view, there is profound consensus I'm sure there's profound consensus in this room and overwhelmingly around the earth if you would engage in sincere conversation with ordinary men and women, and you would ask them the question, is it a good thing that we have nuclear weapons? Most would search themselves and answer back to us, no, they're not intrinsically good. But there's a second stream in moral thinking, and we need to take it seriously. And this is where I was thinking of our esteemed colleague, Akashi Sensei. And this kind of moral thinking is sometimes called consequentialism, consequences. If I do X, what's the consequence? So it looks at the problem from the point of view of what the consequence will be. And in this line of thinking, there can be the argument that doing a disordered thing could have potentially relatively good consequences. And this was the argument for deterrence. People who were for deterrence, having nuclear bombs to stop other countries from using nuclear bombs, were not necessarily at all saying nuclear bombs are a good thing. And certainly in the religious communities, they were arguing that nuclear bombs are intrinsically evil, but in a objectively disordered situation, could you make an argument that a limited and very conditional possession of nuclear weapons could be morally justified as the lesser of evils? This was the argument and struggle that our human family was challenged with. And many people, and the reason I mention you, Mr. Akashi, is because you've had to deal with both streams of moral argumentation at the same time and try to balance them, dealing with things that are objectively disordered and evil, and yet having to make choices and how to figure out how to do less harm. And this is, I think, a noble and difficult, strenuously difficult. So in the area of nuclear weapons, I'm suggesting that today we can see that we're at a turning point. The very arguments, the consequentialist arguments that have served as a limited, conditional, provisional justification, not for the use of weapons, but for the possession of weapons, is now coming to the table. We're at another stage of the discourse. There's broad unanimity among many different religious traditions and many moral areas of discourse that use of weapons is off the table. It's immoral. You can't indiscriminately attack other people. Even second use, if you were attacked, would it be moral to launch a massive counterattack and kill indiscriminately the others? Their cities, their children, their grandparents, their hospitals, their schools. So there's an increasing consensus, no, that's off the table. We can't justify that. But where the argument is shifting is in the area of possession itself. And over the last decades, many sincere people, very sincere people, struggled with this and tried to make limited, conditional, temporary justifications that, yes, one could possess these hideous weapons. One couldn't use them, but one could possess them in the argument that this would be a deterrent. And there were three conditions commonly cited. These weapons could be possessed if their sole, I'll just be very quick, if their sole function was to deter. You could only own them if you were going to use them for deterrence. You couldn't have more than you need to deter. They could be only used for deterrence, and you couldn't have more than you needed for deterrence. And you could have them as a lever towards disarmament itself. These were conditions that moral people examined to give a limited conditional justification for possession. Today, we find those very conditions being challenged. Do they really deter? Are they really deterring? Certainly they remain inherently disordered. We could argue they're not adequately deterring. There is continued proliferation taking place. They are, in a sense, preventing disarmament instead of assisting us in disarmament. And they're open to, Reverend Seguino, you mentioned there's a form of a new kinds of arms race taking place in the renovation of the nuclear arsenals. And secondly, and lastly, they're always open to accidents. So what's happening, I would submit, is that the very moral consequentialist arguments trying to help us to understand whether having weapons themselves could be morally justified are increasingly being brought to the spotlight. And increasingly, I would suggest, we can find an emerging consensus that these arguments for possession are increasingly not holding up, not holding water. I think that is of particular importance for us as a coalition of religious communities and other sectors, the political, and I believe that we can serve this movement by focusing very sharply on the weakness of the ethical case for possession itself. So thank you very much.